How do bees make honey? The incredible secret of the hive. Have you ever wondered what you're really looking at when you see a jar of honey? It may look like an ordinary sweet food sitting on a kitchen shelf, but every drop of honey is the result of an extraordinary journey. A journey that begins inside a flower, continues through the body of a tiny insect, and ends inside one of the most organized societies in the natural world. But here's the strange part. Honey doesn't actually begin as honey. It begins as a thin, watery liquid called nectar. So how does a bee transform that liquid into the thick, golden honey we know? And how can thousands of tiny insects work together to collect food, build their home, raise their young, communicate across long distances, and keep an entire colony alive? To find out, let's follow a single worker bee on her journey. Our story begins outside the hive. A worker bee leaves her colony and flies into the surrounding landscape in search of flowers. She's not looking for just any flower. She needs to find a good source of nectar and pollen. Once she discovers one, she lands on the flower and begins collecting. Using her long, flexible tongue called a proboscis, she reaches deep inside the flower and draws out tiny amounts of nectar. But the nectar doesn't go straight into her stomach. Instead, it is stored in a special compartment called the honey crop, sometimes known as the honey stomach. You can think of it as a temporary storage tank. The bee can fill this compartment with nectar and carry it safely back to the colony. But collecting enough nectar to make honey is not a quick job. A bee may visit hundreds of flowers during her foraging trips, and she may not always stay in one place. She may fly from flower to flower, searching for the richest sources of food. Then, loaded with nectar, she begins the journey home, and this is where the transformation starts. Even before the bee reaches the hive, enzymes inside her body are already changing the nectar. These enzymes help break down some of the more complex sugars in the nectar into simpler sugars. But the liquid is still far too watery to be called honey. The real work is only beginning. When the forager finally returns to the hive, she doesn't simply pour the nectar into a container. Instead, the nectar becomes part of a remarkable chain of cooperation. The returning bee passes the nectar to another bee. That bee processes it further before passing it along again. As the nectar moves through the colony, the bees continue adding enzymes that help change its chemical composition. Eventually, the processed nectar is placed inside one of the tiny hexagonal cells of the honeycomb. But there's still a problem. The nectar contains a lot of water, and if the bee simply left it that way, it could ferment and spoil. So the colony has to remove much of that water, and the bees have developed a surprisingly simple solution. They use their wings. Inside the hive, worker bees rapidly beat their wings, creating currents of air. The moving air helps water evaporate from the nectar. Slowly, the watery liquid becomes thicker. The bees continue this process until the nectar has lost enough water to become stable honey. And when the honey is ready, the bees seal the cell with a thin layer of beeswax. The result is a perfectly packaged food reserve. The colony can store it and use it later when food outside becomes difficult to find. And honey has another remarkable property. It is naturally resistant to spoilage. Its low water content makes it difficult for many microorganisms to grow. Its acidic environment provides another layer of protection. This is one reason honey can remain preserved for remarkably long periods under the right conditions. Ancient honey has even been discovered in archaeological sites in Egypt, preserved for thousands of years. But here's something that makes the whole process even more impressive. A colony doesn't just need a little honey, it needs a huge amount of food to support thousands of bees. That means countless journeys, millions of flowers, and an enormous amount of teamwork. But how does one bee tell the others where to find the best flowers? She can't speak, she can't draw a map, and she certainly can't send a text message. Instead, she dances. Inside the dark hive, a returning forager performs a remarkable sequence of movements known as the waggle dance. At first, it may look like nothing more than a bee moving around on the honeycomb, but hidden inside that movement is information. The dance can tell other bees where to fly. The bees use the position of the sun as a reference. The direction of the dance helps communicate the direction of the food source, and the duration of the waggle can provide information about how far away that source is. So a bee can return from a distant field of flowers and effectively communicate a set of directions to the rest of the colony. But the story becomes even more impressive. Bees can navigate using information from the sky. Even when clouds make the sun difficult to see, they can detect patterns of polarized light that help them estimate the sun's position. For such a small animal, this is an extraordinary navigational system, and it is only one example of how sophisticated the life of a bee really is. Because inside the hive, thousands of bees are working together, but they are not all doing the same job. A honeybee colony is generally made up of three main types of bees: workers, drones, and the queen. The queen is the reproductive center of the colony. Her primary role is to produce the next generation. During periods of high activity, a healthy queen can lay an astonishing number of eggs. But despite the name, she doesn't rule the colony like a human queen. She doesn't sit on a throne giving orders. Instead, the colony functions through the combined actions of thousands of individuals.
And the most important question is, how does a bee become a queen in the first place? The answer begins when the bees are still developing. A future queen and a future worker both begin life as female larvae. So what makes one become a queen while the other becomes a worker? One major factor is nutrition. Young larvae receive special food from worker bees, but as they develop, their diets can take different paths. A developing queen receives royal jelly throughout her larval development. Other female larvae destined to become workers receive a different diet as they grow. These nutritional differences influence the development of their bodies and reproductive systems. The result is remarkable. Two female bees can begin with the same basic genetic potential, yet develop into completely different members of the colony. One becomes the reproductive center, the other becomes a worker. And the worker bees are the true workforce of the hive. They perform an astonishing number of jobs. Some care for the young, some clean the cells, some produce wax, some build the honeycomb, some process food, some guard the entrance, and others leave the hive to search for nectar and pollen. Interestingly, a worker bee's responsibilities can change throughout her life. Younger workers often spend more time inside the hive. As they grow older, they may take on new responsibilities. Eventually, many become foragers and begin flying outside the colony. So a worker bee doesn't necessarily have one job for her entire life. Her role can change as the needs of the colony change. Then there are the drones, the male bees. Their primary role is reproduction. Unlike worker bees, they do not normally perform most of the daily tasks required to maintain the hive. And then there is the queen's own journey. At the appropriate stage of her life, a young queen leaves the colony on mating flights. She mates with males and stores sperm inside her body. Later, she can use that stored sperm to fertilize eggs throughout her reproductive life. This allows the colony to produce generation after generation of new bees. But the queen alone cannot keep the colony alive. The entire system depends on cooperation. And perhaps the best example of that cooperation is the honeycomb. Look closely at a honeycomb. It is made of thousands of repeating hexagonal cells. These cells can store honey and pollen. They can also serve as nurseries where young bees develop. The structure may look simple, but it is an extraordinary example of natural engineering. The repeating hexagonal pattern allows the bees to create a large amount of storage space while using wax efficiently. And that wax doesn't appear by magic. Worker bees produce it using specialized glands on their bodies. They then shape it into the intricate structure we know as the honeycomb. The hive itself is more than just a shelter. It is a carefully managed environment. The bees regulate its temperature, they manage food supplies, they protect the entrance, they care for developing young, and they respond to changing conditions both inside and outside the colony. But there is no single bee controlling everything. No bee sees the whole picture. Yet together they accomplish something extraordinary. They navigate landscapes, they communicate without words, they build complex structures, they regulate their environment, they preserve food for the future, and while doing all of this, they help countless flowering plants reproduce. So the next time you look at a jar of honey, don't just see a sweet food, see the flowers behind it. See the thousands of journeys, see the complex communication, see the countless tiny decisions made by thousands of insects, and remember that every drop represents something much bigger than a bee working alone. It represents cooperation, organization, survival, and one of the most fascinating examples of what can happen when thousands of tiny individuals work together. Because perhaps the most incredible thing about honeybees isn't what one bee can do, it's what an entire colony can accomplish together.